what had made me successful in retail wasn't just my retail and fashion knowledge. It was all of these other things, my ability to problem solve, my ability to build relationships, curiosity, effective listening skills, me working on engineering roles. I've never done it before, but this isn't the first time I haven't done that. You have to be comfortable putting your stamp on things, bringing opinions to the table. Hey, in this industry, we've seen X, Y, and Z as we've spoken to candidates. Here's where and how we think it's translatable. How do they get there? What is their approach? What is their thought process? And to me, those things, none of those attributes need to come from SaaS and tech. That can show up in a variety of different ways.
Hi, Danielle. How are you?
Hey there. Thanks for having me. I'm great.
Yeah, really excited to have you on the podcast. So to jump in, I think you've got a really intriguing, background and a really interesting set of experiences. And I think a lot of people that are in, talent and recruiting are finding ways to maybe move out of traditional industries and different industries into technology. And you managed to do that incredibly successfully. Could you maybe start by talking about your journey in retail and how you ended up in technology?
Sure. So it's kind of a funny story, and it wasn't an easy transition, but life circumstances. I had spent nearly 15 years in New York working in fashion and retail. And so I really had honed in my expertise. I knew how stores ran. I knew why we picked clothes the way that we did. I knew what right looked like for retail in a more traditional sense, that brick and mortar store retail. I was an expert there. I loved it. I knew it. Even to this day, I can go into some stores in New York and I either know the leaders or I know how the store is running and the whys behind it, which can be really funny when I'm with a bunch of friends and I stop and just kind of take it all in. Through life, I met my now husband here in New York, but he is a Kiwi. So he's from New Zealand. We started having conversations about moving to the other side of the world. I'd never lived abroad. New York was where I had really honed in my career. I was an expert in my trade and didn't really think about it. I got really excited just about the life experience. So David and I moved down he actually found an awesome role at a tech startup called Safety Culture, now a unicorn in the market, really high performing, large tech startup. And we moved to Sydney, sight unseen for me. I had never been to Sydney. And I took about a year just off. One, I wasn't legally allowed to work there. I didn't have my working rights and just really took toll of what was going on in the market. I knew nothing about it and trying to kind of understand what I could do professionally. Fast forward, I made a ton of connections in the tech space. And unbeknownst to me before I moved, there isn't a really deep fashion and retail scene in terms of, the type of work I had done. New York is, heaving with corporate offices in the retail and fashion space, not so much in Sydney, Australia. So really it was a kind of the circumstances of my life. And I was super fortunate that I met some founders who made introductions for me. And then I ended up getting an opportunity at a small tech startup called Propeller Aero. So life and lack of circumstances or opportunities, I should say, kind of forced me in that direction. And here I am 5 years later.
Awesome. And I know you mentioned you kind of took the year off to kind of research, build your network and figure out what the market was doing. Did you find it challenging to, get into tech? Did you find there was some bias against you not having that experience? Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. It was really interesting. I'd never in my life been in a position where I didn't have an opportunity. I had never not worked. So that was weird. So I was spending my time in a different way. And I did a lot of volunteering, which was really cool. But part of the reason I was off for so long is people were really apprehensive of my transition. I started making connections once I had the ability to work in the new country, which was a process in itself. And people really weren't connecting the dots of the minute they saw, these names on my CV, Giorgio Armani, American Eagle, they thought, cool, what does that mean for us? And what I really had to do was hone in on talent acquisition and HR principles are very transferable, but people really were getting stuck in the industry I was working on. So it was a grind. It was a grind. So what I did, I really leveraged making connections with people that were working in TA and HR at other tech companies. My husband, I was fortunate, made me introductions within his world. And there were a lot of leaders at Safety Culture that kind of took me under their wing and really helped me hone in what is transferable. And quite naturally through the initial conversations, what I was hearing for people is what I actually began to focus on, which was business acumen. I knew KPIs, and granted, they were a little different in my industry. It wasn't SaaS. It wasn't the type of recurring revenue. I got it. I knew what the numbers meant. And so I was able to very quickly transition that and be able to have talk points there. General EQ and effective communication. That's something that was very clear in my initial conversations with people. So they became more willing to make other introductions for me the minute we sat together and they saw, okay, she's pretty switched on and she's keen to hustle. That was absolutely a door opener for me. But it took a lot of conversations and I can't tell you how many times I submitted my CV a bit blindly because I didn't necessarily have connections in those first couple of months. I've never received more rejections in my life. So that was a bit of a learning experience, a dose of humility that I was coming from a place where the minute New York, when you saw the brand names and the type of work I was doing, no question it opened doors. And then that contrast of actually closing doors on me because of it was definitely an ego hit. So
I can imagine, yeah. Because exactly like you said, when you hear those brands in the retail world, they're like the creme de la creme of that space. But then you're going straight into, I guess, being unproven in the tech world. And then I guess through that journey of interviewing and applying for different jobs, would you say that the way you were positioning yourself dramatically changed from the start to the beginning of that process? And if you could have kind of fast forwarded it right to the end, what would you recommend for people?
Yeah, great question. So absolutely, the way I positioned myself was different. Quite frankly, I went in, one of the things was just building that knowledge set. So like, be hungry, be curious. I should have started really digging in and making connections amongst the HR and TA community where I wanted to be really quickly. And that took me a while. I thought I could do it on my own. And that's something I would say is leverage a network, even if it's not an existing network. That was such an eye-opening experience for me. And through that, I was able to curate the things that were actually synergized. I wasn't able to do it on myself. I just, I was like, well, of course I know these things. And of course, reading that job description, whether it's Canva or Atlassian, I do all of those things. Of course, it's translatable. So talking to others, like making my network, and just diving right into that early on would have probably saved me 6 months of, eye rolls and feeling the pain of rejection. And again, through those conversations with people that were living, breathing, doing it, but in tech versus a different industry, it became even clearer that, what had made me successful in retail wasn't just my retail and fashion knowledge. It was all of these other things, my ability to problem solve, my ability to build relationships, curiosity, effective listening skills, and I started to hone in on examples, so that once the network started introducing me to people that got me the introductions, because my CV alone wasn't doing that, I was able to use pretty specific examples that I thought were quite translatable and how I guided hiring managers through thinking differently about talent. The example of roles that would come onto my plate or my team's plate previously that we didn't know what the heck they were, and we had to figure it out. And I said, similar to me working on engineering roles, I've never done it before, but this isn't the first time I haven't done that. And here are some examples of how I approached that. And what came to fruition was success. So absolutely building my network sooner and just talking to people. And quite frankly, I look back, it's actually quite heartwarming to think about how many people took me under their wing. I considered myself like a networker before. I was bopping around at all these events in New York, the different recruitment events. I would, walk into anything and be really comfortable talking, but I was so out of my element that it took me a while to ramp that back up again.
Yeah.
So
And building that network seems like it was really key for you. Was it a case of just going into environments like events or reaching out to people directly on LinkedIn? Where did you find the most success in generating that network?
sure. So I was my circumstances were a little bit kind of they themselves set me up for success. So my husband was working for a tech company, one of the largest in Sydney. It was a lot smaller at the time. So David was really closely connected with the senior leaders, the head of HR there, who was the person, and the head of TA hired him directly. So he was able to very quickly, once I got serious about finding a job, I took a couple weeks to hang out in Sydney. Let's be clear, I didn't dive immediately in. But once I started to get serious about it, he was able to make those connections. And I knew them on a social level already. So I had rapport. And they were able to just crack open. Sydney was, a relatively small market at the time. It's grown leaps and bounds. And through that, kind of those immediate connections, the founder at Safety Culture, the two heads of HR and TA, they opened doors really quickly for me. Introduced me to a VC, Blackbird. In turn, I ended up getting, and who they shared out my CV. And then in turn, I ended up working with a Blackbird backed organization, Propeller. And kind of the rest was history. What I didn't understand going into tech is how much I would really like it. And there was a big element of, there was a learning curve, not necessarily in the areas I expected. But pace and velocity definitely were different. Being scrappy and not having all the resources, that stuff was different. I think anyone that worked with me in Sydney can attest. It certainly wasn't this enormous, miss in terms of my skill set. There was a lot of things that really made sense. And I also, with my different experience, helped them think differently too. What about this? Have we thought about that? I've seen this be successful. So it was a lot.
Yeah, I was actually going to talk about that. It seems like there was this kind of winding road to get the opportunity, but once you had it, what was that like? Was it like this big eye-opening thing that you were like, oh my God, it's so different? Or was there a lot of synergy? And actually, the perspective you had, I'm sure that made you more successful in a lot of areas and gave some fresh eyes to problems. So
yeah.
Can you talk about that experience once you got into tech? I guess what you saw the biggest differences and maybe where you could leverage that different perspective.
Yeah. So first and foremost, thinking back on what was different, it wasn't necessarily the day-to-day of what you do as a recruiter. And what I mean by that is, to a certain extent, recruiting is recruiting is recruiting. Like you have to find talent. There's an employer branding component. There's, a qualification stage of really understanding what right looks like, what's a culture add. So getting to know an organization, all of those things I would say are the same. For me, what was really different is I was coming from an organization that had senior leaders who had been 25 years in retail. And I was, learned from them over a period of time. There were thousands of people. The last company I had worked for before transitioning had 3,000 people globally. I transitioned into an organization that had, I think it was 56 at the time that I started. So some of the things were, that were really different were, what are your priorities? I was coming from organizations where foundations had been set, and I was kind of up leveling some fundamental, like how we recruit, competencies, interview training guides, etc. But I was going into a somewhat starting from scratch. I don't want to take away from what they had been doing, but there really wasn't a scalable set of procedures or things that we were doing. And so I think the big difference, and I would say it still stands true coming from a much more corporate environment to today, even at a place like Yotpo, where we're thousands of employees, or a little over 1,000, I should say, but soon to be thousands, with foundations. But even still, the pace at which we operate, the sense of urgency, the ability to be agile, that's a lot different in tech because the landscape changes a lot. And for me, I was the TA and somewhat HR person on the ground because I was doing kind of full life cycle and partnering with the head of ops, Izzy, on, culture amp surveys and So there wasn't as much in my lane of TA, which I found really fun and exciting, but inevitably coming from a corporate structure, your job description is your job description. I love that about tech and growing companies, that there's a lot of blurred lines, there's a lot of ambiguity, and it allows you have to be comfortable putting your stamp on things, bringing opinions to the table. I think I was quite floored of, how much credibility I had coming in and making suggestions and ideas, and people were saying, run with it. There wasn't this whole idea of scoping and taking 3 months to get by. And it was like, just do it. And so I think it's less about the day-to-day, what you're doing as a TA person feels very different across industry. It's how you're doing it, the pace in which you're doing it, and what tools you have to lever. So that's what I found to be really different.
Talentful provides flexible recruiting solutions to the world's most ambitious companies. Are you thinking about ways to add flexibility to your talent function? With recent market volatility and hiring set to return to growth mode in the near future, there's never been a better time to choose the right partner to help you scale. Talentful's embedded sourcing, recruiting, coordination, and talent advisory services have been trusted by the world's leading brands. Companies such as Atlassian, Microsoft, Expedia, Pinterest, Waymo, and more. Whether you're hiring across engineering, go-to-market, or G&A, Talentful has got you covered. To find out how Talentful can help you, visit talentful.com.
That's really, really interesting. And I know that we were talking about this earlier, but some of the, I think, most successful companies during this post-pandemic, really hot market have been the companies that have opened their horizons, like thinking outside of the box about the talent they're bringing on board. And I guess thinking about things like you just said is about, the skill set that the people bring and maybe training them up on the how they're doing it. And I know that you've adopted that approach for how you've maybe been building your talent teams and your functions since you've got into tech. And that seems to have been really successful. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you've gone about building teams and the success you've had? I guess also I'm really interested in how you spot those people who have the right skills, but also can handle a high growth environment and all those things that you just mentioned about lack of process and having to act fast and make decisions, and it's maybe not for everyone. So how you've done that?
Yeah. So one of the things I take quite seriously about being a recruiter is not just the work we do bringing in awesome talent and making sure it's an equitable process and we have inclusive candidates, and it's actually knowing the landscape and knowing about the broader market. And when I say that, it's what I think we've really honed in on a team is looking at different types of companies and saying, okay, we know that we've talked to people from this company before, and we know that they operate in this type of way. We know that they, there's a lot of ambiguity in what they're doing. We know that they have, multiple products that they're dealing with, et cetera. So our team, we are really leaning into our market knowledge to help hiring managers see things a little bit differently. And so, I think leading by example, first and foremost, within my team, there's 2 individuals that don't have, a track record of success specifically within technology. They haven't been in the tech space, one of which is coming from fashion. So I had, inevitably a bias towards it because I knew the types of things that were coming from past fashion that could be implementable. And then in turn, I really rely on our teams, my team in particular. One, they're showing up as success stories. People know that they've come from different industries. And when I tell you they are absolutely crushing it, they're their own, demonstration of what success can look like if we think a little bit outside of the box. And then also really honing in on, so for us, knowing what right can look like in other organizations and really coaching our hiring teams through that. Hey, in this industry, we've seen X, Y, and Z as we've spoken to candidates. Here's where and how we think it's translatable. And our team loves that. It's a super curious team that's constantly trying to, get more insights we can provide back. And then the other thing is honing in on really, as we think about how we're evaluating talent, creating really structured processes that include evaluating based on competency. So observable behaviors and skills that high impact candidates have. And so when we're, setting up to hire for a role, it's less about, do they know Salesforce? We can teach Salesforce. What are those core attributes that currently successful people on the team have? And in those situations, we often leverage those individuals that we've brought on board that didn't have, e-commerce, SaaS, high scale experiences, but have been able to prove success in the business. So we absolutely leverage those use cases as well. And there's quite a few of them. And so that for us has made it a lot easier. But again, when you're talking about competencies, behaviors versus, hard skills of what is actually happening in someone's day to day, it's more, how do they get there? What is their approach? What is their thought process? We help to navigate what's coachable, what's not coachable. And again, bring in our value add, which is other companies can provide this type of environment. That's how we roll. Let's connect the dots here.
And so if I was interviewing for your team as a recruiter, what do you look for? Like, what would I have to do to impress you in an interview? I guess that'd be really interesting to hear.
So first and foremost, effective communicator. I mean, from the minute we're jumping on the line, how you're presenting yourself, how you're speaking really fluidly to what you're doing, where you want to be, et cetera. That effective communication piece, which is inclusive of high EQ. You can read the room, you understand. I mean, that's a huge element of our job. That's kind of a threshold that we can have in our initial conversations. Specifically, given what success looks like on our team, it's that business acumen. Now, I'm not speaking to tech, SaaS, high growth. I want to hear how you're talking about your current business. How are you making decisions and helping navigate with your hiring managers based on your broader knowledge of the organization, whether it's retail, whether it's insurance. For me, I'm super open to profiles. And then I want to understand how you're influencing and navigating the when we get stuck. It is a very difficult environment out there. In our world, we're really lucky. We have great employer brand. People do know about us, but we're not the Google of the world. So you have to really navigate expectations amongst hiring teams, And so what does that look like? How do you influence individuals' experience or examples of being able to influence, specifically when a search gets stuck? I like that example. So what's the most difficult search you've worked on? Tell me where it got stuck. How did you unstick it? And that can, based on the types of solutions they're bringing to the table, I really like it when someone can, in our world, it's really beneficial, problem solve. Listen, we do not have all the right answers. The market is wild. It continues to shift. So how can someone pivot, create different solutions, different ways of looking at things? And to me, those things, none of those attributes need to come from SaaS and tech. That can show up in a variety of different ways. So that's what those are kind of my top three.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think in roles like recruiting, even sales and a lot of others, behavior and I guess the drive and ambition and all the kind of softer skills really play a massive role. I think sometimes it's lazy interviewing, just looking at past companies, because every company is so different that just because you've been one place, it doesn't mean necessarily you're going to be successful. And I think people get into the trap of looking at these massive brand names and taking that as a vote of confidence. And especially in recruiting, being in these big companies with huge brands, huge inbound flows of candidates, it's actually easier potentially to be a recruiter in those places. So I think that's something that leaders need to be aware of. And I guess, for leaders who are thinking about doing this and, opening up their, idea of what a great recruiter could be in their organization, I'm guessing there's some ramp that's needed and some element of setting the people in your team up for success and helping them with that steep learning curve. How have you found success? And I guess what would you recommend to people thinking about doing this to get their team up to speed and fill in those gaps as quickly as possible?
Yeah. So first and foremost, it's starting with being open-minded and really thinking outside the box of, where you're finding talent. And really understanding what the learning curves, I mean, if you have an existing team, I think I'm stating the obvious here, but like, what would you have done differently? Talking to the team about what has really enabled them, what have been those unblocks, what have been those aha moments. And I've consistently iterated on that. When I joined Yotpo, as we've evolved over 2 years, so has my team. And inevitably we're, coaching and getting someone up to speed quicker and faster, but in a much different way. And for me, what's been great is we have an awesome culture within Yotpo that is, we're business partners to the business, which I think is quite different than how other teams can look at talent acquisition. It was one of the huge reasons I wanted to come. I wanted to sit at the table with my business partners, help make decisions versus, being a transactional, here's a CV and move on, here's a CV and move on. That's definitely not exciting to me. And the reason I say that is we have a lot of buy-in from our leaders to ensure that our teams are part of conversations, where they're part of the all hands, they're part of weekly meetings. So for me, one of the things is, outside of staying really closely connected, is finding opportunities for the teams to get really immersed in the business as a business partner. To be hearing, seeing the whys. Why are we making business decisions? How does that affect how we're hiring a sales engineer and where we're hiring a sales engineer? A really close partnership with our HRBP team so that they can understand, like, we're very immersed in the whole talent lifecycle from hiring through attrition and everything in between. We speak really openly. So that's been really leveraging that team to help with onboarding and just making sure we have close connection points as well. And then the other thing is, making sure that this sounds like the silliest, simplest thing, but no question is off limits. I think really empowering the team at the very beginning of, we've got a boatload of acronyms, which can feel different than any other business. And we make up our own acronyms. So always asking why. There isn't a silly question. Always, positioning during your conversations, being comfortable to say, I'm not sure what that is. Can we double click here? And that has, I think empowering the team to think and feel that way and operate that way means that even post onboarding, we still in an ever-changing, evolving environment because we're a high growth, fast scaling company and the world is changing every moment. There's a lot of things that we need to continue to be understanding and learning. Like, I'm learning every day here. And that's enabled us to create ongoing kind of in-depth being immersed within the business. So not just ramp up time, but also like continued immersion too.
Yeah. And your team fully remote? Are they hybrid? Like, what does that look like at the moment?
We work in a hybrid capacity right now. So we have sites globally. But we are in New York and Austin here in the States. And we really enjoy getting together. So we've been on average between 1 and 2 days a week. The teams come into the New York office. Those are our busiest days, but they're also the most fun. And for our team, we really love having the in-person connection, sitting in live on the meetings as they're happening, popping over to CS and seeing how people are doing now that they've onboarded. We keep a pretty tight feedback loop with our new hires and the teams. So that really enables us to do it in a little bit more fun way.
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely one of the most enjoyable parts about working in-house is you get to see the people that you've hired come in and really enjoy their work.
So good.
It's such an amazing thing. And you feel like you've been part of that journey. So have you found that you've had to maybe change what people are doing when they're in the office and focus on more collaborative, items that people are doing rather than just... So I know that a lot of companies have been struggling with, they have these days in the office, but then everyone's just sat in phone booths all day, doing recruiter calls. Have you found an answer to that? Have you found something that you feel works for you and your team?
Sure. So it is a tough balance because we spend a lot of time on the phone and on Zooms, and those those conversations do have to be behind closed doors. we've really curated a pretty good balance as a team that when we're in the office together, we have time for each other. So whether it's a team event or just, naturally creating, like, Tuesdays are a day that the office is really busy. So that's when, we'll try to have like our HR monthly meetings. We haven't completely, I would love to say the perfect solve is X. We've just made sure that, again, on those days I know I'm going to be in the office, I try to leave room so that I'm not back to back on the phone all day. And now that we've gotten into a routine of it, Tuesdays and Wednesdays are big days. I think all of us plan accordingly for that so that it isn't just running around like a crazy, person. It's taking advantage of the time that we have together. So, and for us as a team, we're super fortunate. We also just really enjoy each other. So when we are together, we do lunches or we'll do something after work, and trying to make a routine of that doesn't completely disrupt personal lives, but allows us to have that time together.
Absolutely. I definitely think that even those small interactions that you have, just seeing someone saying hi, they're asking how their day's been, spending a time over a coffee or lunch really deepens the relationship. And especially if you're a recruiter, doing that with your hiring teams is really important, right? Because those relationships are really key. If people know you, they have a relationship with you, they're more likely to help you and support you and I guess forgive you when you mess up, which is a very, very key thing. Awesome. So I'm going to wrap it up, Danielle, but I wanted to ask you one question that I ask everyone, which is, what are you most excited about the future of talent acquisition?
It's like such a loaded question. Innovation, I think, and I know that's that's not a specific example, but there's a lot of us in talent acquisition, as I know you're acutely aware, that it's been a really challenging time for us as professionals. We never know what's around the corner. And so I think it's also given us a lot of time to figure out there has to be better ways of doing X. There has to be better, ways of doing Y. And something about TA is it's never not evolving. So I don't know what that thing is. I would love to say it's headcount planning, because headcount planning in a wild environment is something we talk about all the time. There's not a perfect tool for it. So innovation, whatever that looks like, I'm open, and it's going to keep us busy, right? Regardless. It's a place that's always, we get to learn constantly because it's always something new, a new challenge every single day.
Absolutely. Well, if you can solve the headcount planning issue, Danielle, I think you'll be a trillionaire, because I think
I'm on it. I'm on it.
We'd love for you to do that. But thanks a lot for your time. I think that you've probably inspired a lot of listeners to make the jump and move into tech if they've been thinking about it. So really appreciate your insight, and catch you later.
Thanks for having me.